Hello and welcome to another episode of Downtown Now. Please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A feature provided. Take some time to introduce yourself and engage in conversation by using the chat feature as well. Now I will turn it over to Executive Vice President, Business Development, Michael Diemer.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. For those of you who may not be too familiar with Downtown Cleveland Alliance, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We are the only nonprofit organization that's dedicated exclusively to building a more vibrant downtown and making downtown Cleveland the region's most compelling place to live, work, and play. We're a place-based development organization. We represent property owners, residents, businesses, as well as civic partners. And over the last 15 years, we've concentrated on building a clean, safe, welcoming, and pedestrian-friendly place that attracts additional investment. We can't do this work without the generous support of individuals, small businesses, corporate partners, and foundations. Downtown Cleveland needs your support now more than ever. And in response to an outpouring of support and request for ways to help, the Alliance has launched the Unite Cle Fund. Your donation to this fund will help support small downtown businesses, aid our Voices of Cle public mural program, expand our Seeds workforce readiness program, which provides jobs and job training for individuals who are homeless, and it will sustain our Downtown Cleveland Homeless Fund, which helps us connect individuals who are homeless with shelter and needed services. As Lauren mentioned, we launched the Downtown Now webinar series a few months ago now, and I'd like to thank Cleveland Magazine and Community Leader, our media sponsors, for the project. Since 2018, the Downtown Now insert in Cleveland Magazine has served to highlight the progress of downtown Cleveland, and we've really used the webinar series to chronicle a rapidly changing environment. As downtown Cleveland's population continues to grow, it's increasingly important to ensure that we have public policies that support city building and downtown's growth. It's important that downtown Cleveland businesses, residents, and stakeholders have a voice at City Hall, the State House, and with our congressional delegation. In today's episode, we're going to be talking with some of the leading advocates for city building policies at the state and local level. We'll talk about historic preservation, adaptive reuse, transit-oriented development, and urban development tools. And we have a pair of terrific guests to help us talk about and navigate these issues. We're joined today by Allison Gable, Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center, and Jonathan Sandvik, the President and Founder of Sandvik Architects, Vice Chair of the Downtown Cleveland Alliance Board of Directors, and Chair of the Downtown Cleveland Alliance Advocacy Committee. Allison, Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan, I thought I would begin with you and ask you to help set the table for us a little bit and tell us a little bit about Downtown Cleveland Alliance's role in advocacy, how the Advocacy Committee came about, what are some of the things that it focuses on?
Thank you, Michael. The Advocacy Committee was formed because we have a lot of needs, but there were a lot of lack of clarity of thought. And we were trying to get everybody together to, one, sort out those issues, to make sure that we had a unity of commentary, and that we could simplify and have a clear message going out so that we didn't have multiple messages. So that our first part was to have a consistency of message, make sure that we were on point. And we focus on, our initiatives right now, like public transit, historic preservation, development incentives that would be available, property tax issues, but it could be zoning issues. There'd be many issues that we have. Some are momentary and some are continuously and ongoing. But it's to get those parties downtown all together and come up with a unified strategy, make sure that everyone understood what the concerns, issues, and opportunities were.
Well, there's a lot there that we're going to circle back to over the course of the conversation. But before we do, Allison, I'd like to turn over to you and a lot of our audience may not be as familiar with the work of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. I'd like you to share a little bit about Greater Ohio and who you are and what you do and what some of your priorities are right now.
Yeah, thanks so much. And again, thanks for the invitation. So the Greater Ohio Policy Center is based in Columbus. We work statewide. We want to see a revitalized Ohio and all the communities within it. We are a nonprofit. We do advocacy, research. We do a lot of convenings and facilitating peer learning because we believe in the power of learning from each other. We really focus on the different policy levers and the policy environment that our communities across the state need to thrive and succeed. And because so many of them are, unfortunately, weak market communities, we really are focused on what we call legacy city issues. So we focus on brownfields because we think those are an untapped asset in so many of our communities that have a lot of potential that needs to be unlocked. We do focus on advocating for increased funding from the state for public transportation and the transit systems around the state. And sort of as a secondary concern in that bucket, we also are working a lot with the state around complete streets policies, a statewide complete street policy, and then sort of from there hope to build towards transit-oriented development policies. And then we focus a lot on neighborhood kind of rebuilding work and downtown strengthening, because our downtowns are the heart of our communities, and you see that in Cleveland, but you also see that in smaller places like Lima and Coshocton. So it's through that work, the research that we do to both support local leaders on the ground, but then also encourage and convince our policymakers at the state level to make decisions that are favorable and again, create sort of that environment for our cities. That's our charge here in the state.
Well, in a moment, I want to ask Jonathan to delve into some of the work that has been done with the Alliance and some other partners around the region and around the state on historic preservation and redevelopment. But before I do, Allison, I wanted to ask you to, talk a little bit about the environment at the State House. And I know today this is a unique time right now, but on the issues, the city building issues that you just outlined that you work on, on the one hand, there's a lot of commonality between what goes on in smaller cities in Ohio and our bigger cities. But oftentimes the representation is very different, and we don't always see those commonalities in each other. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the strategies and tactics that you use to engage a diverse state in the issues that you're focused on.
Yeah. Yes, we have a very diverse state with diverse perspectives, and so it can make the work at the State House a lot of fun, right? But that's right. We, I think, as most people know, have a very, it skews fairly rural in terms of who are the representatives and senators at the State House, the communities that they come from. Right now, we have a supermajority in both the House and Senate, and there's variety in what a Republican supermajority looks like, right? There's some very conservative members and some very moderate members, but it does make it, it makes it important to make sure that we talk about cities and community building in a way that feels like people can see it in their own backyards. So we do a lot of work as our organization. I also want to note that we are bipartisan and a moderate organization, and that's a very intentional design feature that the founding board and founding executive directors created in our organization because they thought that was going to be the long-term route for success, and so far it has been. But we really focus as an organization with our partners on what are the areas of common cause and common interest, right? That can be a challenge or an opportunity no matter what size your community is. That said, we are pretty upfront with our policymakers that our cities and the state are where the economic energy comes from, and that our GDP is based 88% of the state's GDP comes from our major metro regions. And so to discount cities is to really economically harm the long-term success of our state. That said, we also want to acknowledge that there is economic activity and opportunity in our smaller, more rural places. And so what are the common tools that those places can, both our large and small communities can use to really strengthen the opportunities that they have? And that's really kind of big picture, how we try to frame a lot of the issues and talk about a lot of our issues, because it is not productive to just focus just on city issues, and it's less productive to focus just on rural issues, and really isn't fair for, you know, the diversity of our state. It's not fair to focus on one issue or the other.
Well, I think that's a good framework for now. You know, circling back to talk a little bit about one of the issues that we spend a lot of time in the advocacy committee at Downtown Cleveland Alliance focused on, and that's the historic tax credits. And I guess for purposes of this conversation, we'll kind of keep it focused on the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit, which has been a terrific tool and it has undergone some challenges at the State House over the last few years, and we can talk about that. But Jonathan, you know, could you begin by, you know, just sharing a little bit about why the historic tax credit has been such an area of focus for DCA and our advocacy priorities, and sort of what it's meant for us in downtown Cleveland?
Yes. Well, let's start with the essence of it. You know, Arthur Fromm, who is the famous travel writer, wrote that nobody wants to visit a city who's lost its soul. And what he was talking about is authenticity and uniqueness. And when we've lost our existing fabric, our history, then we lose our uniqueness, we lose our authenticity. And so that's one component. The other component is one of the inherent things that has to do with how cost works. Historic preservation creates about 50 to 100% more jobs for equal number of dollars spent versus new construction. This has formed the basis for a historic tax credit, because what it allows the tax credit to do is it allows the tax credit to pay the actual state or the actual tax back to the state over the course of about 7 to 9 years. These are studies that have actually been done, and it has been demonstrated. So in essence, it doesn't actually, I like to say, doesn't actually cost the state anything when you look at it long-term, because it pays the actual tax back. Meanwhile, it's creating an enormous amount of development. So for every $1 million of tax credit that go into a project, it creates $40 million of economic activity. Now, that doesn't come from me. That comes directly from the state. The state's own analysis, excuse me. I don't know if you can hear me or not. I bumped the part, but I'll continue on.
We hear you okay, Jonathan.
Okay, can you see me?
We can.
Okay, good. So I've lost you a little bit here, but consequently, the impact is tremendous and it pays the state back. So this has to do with the labor advantage that historic properties have. So the economics favor it. So as a consequence, the state has issued a state historic tax credit, which is 25% of the eligible expenses, and that's virtually all of the expenses, not acquisition, of the development or redevelopment of an existing building. And thus is a tremendous tool. It also draws in federal historic tax credits, which are worth 20% of it. And it's an important note because then it gives additional leverage. As a result of having the state historic tax credit, it's drawn in a lot more federal dollars into the state. In fact, Ohio has been at the top over the last 5 years, in the top states through 1 through 3 continuously. And I believe the last year it was 3rd in the nation as a state that had the most number of historic preservation projects. So the state has been a leader. Cleveland particularly has been the leader in the state. That is When we look at total number of dollars, Cleveland's been very, very successful in achieving that. And that's largely, we have wonderful historic fabric here, and we've had great advocacy for the use of it. Further, this is one of the rare tax credits that must demonstrate for each project that in fact it has the ability to pay the state back. That's incorporated into each tax credit award, and therefore assures that each one of them will have this effect back to the state of paying it directly back. So this is a tremendous advantage over other programs that are available, and thus has sustained the program. That doesn't mean there hasn't been challenges, and indeed the Downtown Cleveland Alliance and our compatriot organizations have been vigorous in helping to make sure that the message is clear. And when it is understood, we've been able to win the day because, of course, it makes absolute economic sense. And with that,
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please,
So
Allison.
I'll just say from a state perspective, we see our smaller communities around the state who also take advantage of the historic preservation tax credit doing incredible things in their downtown, because what often happens is that one building that wins the credit, right, spins off a very positive chain reaction on down the block. And you see that too in Cleveland, right, of course, but that this is really, that can really be the catalyst for some significant repositioning and reactivation in our downtowns. And in our smaller places, sometimes it really just needs to be that one building that really builds the confidence for local private investors to then also invest in the surrounding areas. But we think that the historic preservation tax credit is an incredibly important tool in the state, and are always very supportive of Heritage Ohio, which is the organization that really spearheads the fight and preservation of that tool.
Well, you know, we were talking a little bit before we went on the air about you know, talent attraction and retention in the state of Ohio, and you know how, you know, some of our greatest assets are not just the big cities like downtown Cleveland, but the main streets and courthouse squares that we have all over Ohio. And you know, Allison, I know you do a lot of work in some of those smaller cities, and working with the legislators that represent those smaller cities that we have all over Ohio. And I'm wondering, one, you know, what sorts of public policy issues are you working on in those areas? And as you talk with the legislators that represent those areas, you know, does the economic impact analysis that you just shared, the talent attraction and retention, you know, trying you know, to create the types of walkable, authentic neighborhoods that we know young people want to live and work in. But do those sorts of things resonate with the representatives that you work with?
Yeah, it does. It's funny. Often what we end up, when we start talking about, you know, our need for city building policies, whether it's money to support, you know, public art, or there's a couple state programs we really like, which basically the state connects, provides a match on any funds crowdsourced and raised locally for kind of place making projects. The legislators that we talk to are really into it. And often it's because they have children who have left the state and they want them back, right? And so we're like, wouldn't your children like to go to the breweries and cafes that we have all, you know, in your downtown? And they get it. They get it, they like it, and they often will share stories of success that they're really proud of from their own communities. What we have difficulty doing is bringing painting. What we have difficulty doing is making sure that these issues rise to the top of a very long list of fires to put out at the State House, right? And particularly right now, there are a lot of fires at the State House that it's really a bandwidth issue. And, you know, earlier in my career, I might have thought, oh, they hate cities, you know, in the governor's office or in the General Assembly. And I don't think that's the case. It really, though, is that that people have so much bandwidth, and when the crisis of the day is education or energy policy, right? Like it's hard to show them how the investments we make today in our downtowns can provide that long-term sustainability and prosperity that we want, because it's just not as immediate, right? Like people want to see immediate results. So we are continuing to refine how we talk about these things, and they get it, but again, it's often sort of a bandwidth issue. It helps when constituents talk about the importance, right? And so that's something that, you know, we encourage whenever we talk with local communities, like talk to your legislators, talk to your policymakers, because it's one thing to hear it from us at Greater Ohio. It's a very different thing when you as a constituent, as a campaign donor, raises as a critical issue in your community.
Well, Jonathan, one of the many hats that you wear that I didn't mention in introducing you is that you're also very active as a board member of Heritage Ohio, which is a statewide advocacy organization that focuses very much on historic preservation and redevelopment. And, you know, we all banded together a few years ago when the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit was threatened with a moratorium as part of the state budget process. And I know since then, Heritage Ohio has done a lot of work with, again, smaller communities and the legislators that represent them to try to build support for the historic tax credit. And I wondered if you could share a little bit of, a little bit more about that strategy and to what extent it's been successful. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about whether that's a replicable model for other issues.
I think that's a good point, Michael, for bringing that up. Yes, what we give is, I'll call them coffees across the state, where we assemble everybody together in the community and do an overview, usually the State Historic Preservation Office. And the State Economic Development Office will be participatory and, talk about process for it. What do you do? How does it work? How would it be effective in your area? And getting it, and also for the local legislators, because term limits in the state of Ohio make it very, very hard to keep a continuity of thinking on these issues. So you may think that it's obvious, but the truth is it's continuously changing. They need to be continuously reinformed. I think the most important thing that we've learned is we need to make sure that everybody is benefiting. And what we find is our smaller communities oftentimes struggle a bit more because of complexity, because of lack of knowledge, and making sure that we get the information out to them. And candidly, one of our other goals is to think about increasing the credit size for the smaller projects to provide more incentive. This is to our benefit in our my beloved Cleveland here is what we want to do is to expand the credit. And it isn't just a matter of sharing a very limited pie. I think we understand that it doesn't take any complexity to understand that the economics are there. So therefore, expanding it statewide in order to be able to facilitate, we need to have all legislators from smaller communities and larger communities all pulling for it. And so to the degree of making sure that they can benefit, that they do have the expertise and the knowledge available in the smaller communities is essential for us larger communities like Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati to benefit from it too. So we need to make sure that it's available. So I think, even many of the advocacy issues, which I think you're getting into, need to think about it in this big way, because we're a state. In order to be able to drive those kinds of legislations, we need to think about its broad spectrum impact.
And Allison, again, I know you do, again, a lot of work around the state, and I know you're familiar with a lot of the efforts around historic preservation as an example. But as you as you look at some of the work that, Jonathan and some of his colleagues are doing on this issue, are there, do you see opportunities to, try to build similar coalitions, both to defend policies and to advance policies that support our cities in Ohio?
Yeah, it's a really successful playbook. We use it a lot ourselves. Recently, we've been doing, last year in particular, and previous years, we were doing a lot around, as I mentioned, the increasing public transportation support from the state, right? And we were very successful, and not just because of Greater Ohio's efforts, but so many different organizations' efforts. The funding for public transportation increased more than it had in a decade, which was great. We need to preserve that, right? Especially as we move into a very, very difficult budgeting cycle. But before I get into that, what I want to say is that we have to make the case for public transportation or brownfields or anything. We have to be able to demonstrate how a policy can have, in fact, outsized benefits in rural areas and also great benefits in urban areas. But again, sort of the realities of the legislature is such that we need to be very direct in demonstrating how a policy that they may support can provide direct support to their constituents, which may be in more rural areas. And so that rural urban coalition building, and then also, as Jonathan said, ongoing education. I mean, not only is there term limit issues, but like in the height of the budget season, when legislators are here Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in Columbus, they're taking meetings every 15 minutes. And those meetings are, you're going to have child welfare issues followed by transportation issues, followed by prison reform. I mean, it's just, like we have to be generous with our legislators that we ask them to be experts on a lot of things. And so Jonathan's right, the meeting with them in district is really successful, making sure that the constituents who can speak knowledgeably about an issue are the ones that the legislator can feel comfortable turning to. Those are all really important ways to make sure that issues stay at the top of the list. It's also a lot of work, right? And that's why you have advocacy committees like DCAs, and you have organizations like mine, because that educational process it is labor intensive, but it can have a lot of impact when it's done consistently and in coalition, right? Rarely can you succeed with anything solo, right? It always has to be a coalition effort.
Well, we've talked a lot about strategy, a lot about historic preservation as a little bit of a case study, and Alice and I agree wholeheartedly about public transportation. The Alliance was a big supporter of the efforts in the last operating budget and transportation budget, and we're grateful for the support that was received, and we know a lot more is needed, but particularly to your point in this environment. Hanging on to that is very, very important. I'd like to, expand the conversation a little bit. And again, Jonathan, go back to you and, what are some of the additional policy priorities that, we're focused on here at DCA, but that you see on the horizon that are going to be important for downtown development?
Well, I've talked a lot about historic preservation, but we also need to assist driving new infill development. And so looking for strategies to facilitate policy. So there are a lot of connected policies such as tax abatement, which is essential. I think we know very much, certainly studies recently demonstrate here the need to sustain tax abatement. And that's a common issue in most of our communities across the state, that these are ways to encourage, particularly for housing. And we know from a policy perspective that bringing housing back into our downtowns, large and small across the state, is an important initiative in order to have a 24-hour vitality in our communities. If I could just take one moment to step back to sort of Allison's point, 2 days ago, a session from the Urban Land Institute indicated that um, that the trend now is for people to choose where they want to live, not to choose where the jobs are. So there's a big change. And so having quality of life issues are important. So looking for ways to revitalize our downtowns and inner city neighborhoods is an important, essential part of that. So I just wanted to part that. But infill, and of course we do have legislation now. We have the TMUD legislation that's put forward that would make larger projects possible.
And Jonathan, for our lay audience, can you remind folks what the TMUD stands for?
Yeah, well, it's transformational projects essentially. So these are large projects, and if I step back to this, to the state historic tax credit, it's limited to $5 million as a maximum. When we're talking about very large projects here, projects that have big gaps, they're difficult to drive. Ultimately, they do provide the benefits back to the community, but we need to invest in them now in order to make them happen. These are projects that can have a dramatic impact on transforming, taking large vacant areas, distressed areas, and transforming them in a way that encourages other significant development to happen. So these are for catalytic types. But looking continuously for tools, these are essential in order for us to continue to drive development. Virtually all of our communities have infill needs where we have missing teeth in our streetscapes, and we need that as additional vitality as well. So continuously looking for unique tools to help. Zoning strategies, building code strategies are all part of that. And indeed, as Michael knows, we've been participatory in all of those. Sometimes they're expediting, how to get drawings and so forth expedited for permits, changing zoning strategies, which have happened here in Cleveland as well. These are all a variety of the different needs we have. Certainly in the area of transportation, we have needs that are continuous. Our state struggles to provide sufficient funding, and it's something we continuously need support for. In downtown Cleveland, but really everywhere, you need this available to have your workforce be able to come to work. We need it in our downtown Cleveland. We have a trolley that makes it more convenient for visitors to get around as well as residents. So it makes it highly effective. And these are continuously elements that are difficult to continue to press forward, but it's certainly one of our significant advocacy initiatives as well. So it's really, I'm sorry, Michael, go ahead.
No, go ahead and wrap up. I was going to, pitch kind of the same question to Allison, but please share your closing thought.
Well, again, we also have to be ready to address immediate concerns and needs. Obviously, we had distress in the downtown because obviously a very legitimate concern and protest emerged. But when you've got the fervor happening, we had some damage downtown, and we needed to help those property owners correct that damage. And we immediately worked together to come up with a strategy to do it. So we have to be facile and responsive, so it's continuously changing. So as you know, we've operated on the nationwide level where when the federal historic tax credit was threatened, that we were able to meet with Portman directly, and candidly, Ohio was the winner of the day in saving the federal historic tax credit.
Oh, for sure. Well, before we turn it over to some questions from the audience, Allison, I kind of want to ask you the same question. What issues do you see on the horizon that Greater Ohio is working on now, and that over the remainder of this year and into the early part of next year that you think will be the areas of focus?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I think Jonathan did a really nice job of is talking about how there's both state and local, interplay going on with policy. So one of the things that we've been really trying to hone our policy ask on is encouraging the state to provide funds for technical assistance and consultants at the local level to really help locals kind of figure it out, right? And in Cleveland, you guys would sort of probably be held up as an example of figuring it out at the local level, but there's many communities around the state, particularly our smaller ones, that know that they don't want to, they want something to change, they just don't even know where to start, right? But they don't have the resources to even hire like a planning consultant to even know where to begin, right? So we're encouraging the state to make those small investments today in order to teach both locals at the local level, you know, how to do planning in the future, but then also to really kind of kick off that process. More immediately, one of the things that we're working on very actively right now is in a coalition of others to try to get the state to establish an emergency rental assistance program. We have, you know, as a result of COVID, many Ohioans out of work. Many of them are low income who are already pretty in very tenuous positions to begin with. And so while there were a number of different programs that were sort of insulating the impact of that, those have gone away or are going away. And we're really concerned that evictions are going to go up, that housing instability is going to go up. And as a result, like you're just going to have this huge trickle, you know, huge impact through the economy as renters can't pay their rents, then their landlords can't pay their mortgages, and, you know, on and on and on. So about 20 other states or more across the country have established emergency rental assistance programs that are using CARES Act dollars. Ohio hasn't yet, and we are hoping that that will happen soon. The other thing that we're both long-term and short-term thinking about is a lot of the things that Jonathan was talking about, that it's hard to do development in weak market communities. And Cleveland is doing great work, but, you know, the margins are really thin in Cleveland, and they're even thinner elsewhere. And so how do we get cheap, patient, risk-tolerant capital into these places? And, you know, I'm not even just talking about grants, although certainly grants are helpful, but you know, just lending that can really have that quality of risk tolerance that we need in order to, right, you prove it with one building, and then the market strengthens, and then, you know, lenders are willing to enter, particularly for downtown redevelopment. But so that's something that we've been really thinking about and working with various partners around the state to refine, because that feels like a major hiccup or a major stumbling block for so many communities. And, you know, Cleveland would benefit from something like that, a fund with that has very risk tolerant, patient, long-term capital. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about, but there's a lot of other things. If we have time, I can get into it more, but a lot of it really has to do with sort of responding to COVID and how that's kind of reshuffling the deck in terms of state policy and what some of those implications could be for our cities, some of which are pretty dire, some of which are just going to be financially really stressful.
Okay.
So I'll stop there, but we can,
yeah, I think it's a great place to pause and look to Lauren to see whether we have some questions coming in from the audience for Jonathan and Allison.
Plenty of questions. First one, looking to the future, is there a single tool or incentive that you think is most important for places like downtown Cleveland?
There are no silver bullets. Yeah. Silver buckshot, but silver bullet.
It's difficult to name one because they all are important. So whether we're talking about tax abatement or there are many of them, but you know, certainly what we do know is even by the state's own analysis, that the state historic tax credit pays itself back. And in this sense, we know that its return is there, and it has a 40-to-1 return. And that's an enormous number of returns. So their own analysis shows that $1 million is creating, I believe it's almost 400 jobs, like 393 jobs, and has $40 million of economic activity. So that's the state's own analysis. That's pretty hard to compare to. So if you had to choose one tool, and of course we talked a lot about that as a tool, that's certainly significant. But I believe, as Allison pointed out, there are no silver bullets. There's not one tool. It would be difficult to say there were one, because there are a multiple of issues, everything from zoning to state laws to there are so many initiatives that are important to sustaining vitality and development.
Elson, did you want to elaborate on that, or?
I don't mean to be flippant, but really there is no one silver bullet. If we had it, we would have, we would have fought for it. But I do think there is silver buckshot. I mean, the other thing too about all the programs that we've talked about, particularly the earlier conversation about sort of the rural urban, is that the real advantage of like the historic preservation tax credit and other programs like that is that they're flexible so that locals can use them in the way that fits best to the local context. And those are the most successful programs, both from a state perspective, but also from a local perspective. So, no, I can't say this is what downtown Cleveland needs, but what I can say is that a range of programs, right, working in concert with each other could be really valuable and always is.
Next question, at 63 cents per capita, Ohio currently ranks 8th lowest in the nation for transportation investment.
Somebody's done their homework.
This is from our team. This is from our team, Michael Collier. Ranks 8th lowest in the nation for transportation investment. What needs to be done at the policy level to ensure the viability and growth of our transit system for our transit systems like RTA?
Well, I don't know that I have the answer for that question, but other than, first of all, we need to make sure that everyone's educated on it, because oftentimes there are many, and I know many legislators don't realize how low Ohio actually ranks. This is an important issue. So let me just step back, way back for one moment. We have the Black Lives Matter issue. And if we want to ensure that our constituency and our Black brothers and sisters are supported, then we also need to make sure that we have access for everybody to jobs. And this is an issue that is a big issue here. And we need to make sure this is happening, because our community, certainly Cleveland being one of them, really needs good transportation in order to make sure that they're empowered. So this is an issue that's important. I'm hoping that that can be a party to the issue of raising the consciousness statewide and nationally, as well as locally, to assist that process. So while I haven't given you any specific tools, it's still it's a challenging issue. I've certainly been immersed in it, and I certainly respect it, and I certainly think that we need to improve it dramatically. So I'm certainly with you on that.
So amen to all that. Greater Ohio, some of the research that we've done recently has looked at exactly how to improve that number. So first and foremost, we think it would be really valuable if the state had a dedicated funding source for public transportation, because then the funding is fairly reliable, consistent, and predictable, because it would be coming from a dedicated source, right? Second, we've identified several of those sources. So one, parking until recently was not parking is not subject to the state sales tax, and we estimated that would generate about $33 million a year if we were to tax like parking garages, your use at a parking garage, whether it's a day rate or monthly. Another source of funding that we looked at is this really funky loophole that basically if you buy a car and you're out of state, but you buy a car in Ohio, you don't have to pay sales tax. It's a bit, anyway, there's money there that we think is about $50 million. So there's different pots of, basically different services or goods that could be subject to different sources of excise taxes, which then could generate those dollars for a dedicated funding source. And then of course we need to encourage and demonstrate the value to ODOT to shift the way that federal funds are deployed in Ohio. So feds give a lot of flexibility to the dollars that they give to states. In Ohio, about 90, no, it's more than that. Most of the money that the feds give to Ohio goes into our highways, but we have the flexibility to dedicate it more to public transportation. ODOT just elects not to. And so really changing that formula around the federal highway dollars would be game changing. Advocates have been trying for years, and we are going to continue to, but yes, it's going to take a long time to rise in those ranks because we are just so low. And it's given how urban the state is, as well as how diverse the needs are. And also, as Jonathan pointed out, how our job hubs have moved out of our cities. The need for transportation is very apparent. And it's something that nobody seems particularly prepared to want to face head on. But again, I want to give kudos to the legislators who did argue for and win funding for increased public transportation funding in the last transportation budget. It's going to be really important to retain that if we want to do any sort of expansion of that fund in the future.
Great. How can regular people advocate for downtown Cleveland, whether they be residents, visitors, or just those who care about the city?
Allison, you want to go first?
Sure. So in my mind, it would be advocating to state policymakers. And I think, as I've said, it's so important for legislators to hear from their constituents, to be shown at first person what their constituents are talking about, right? So like doing the tours that Jonathan described, having people come tell their personal stories, those are really persuasive because of the human element to it. Letter writing campaigns and phone campaign, email campaigns, okay. Phone campaigns, that's a little more, but really, again, it's the most labor intensive work that you do is probably going to have the best results, but your average person can have a lot of sway in just by making sure that they are consistently talking to policymakers and their staff, right? Don't forget the aides and staff because they are just as important as the actual policymaker themselves.
Jonathan, anything you would add?
Well, I certainly would concur that really your personal stories are so important to your legislators, and they do have an impact. They really do want to hear them. And, being able to share them is important. I think the other part is to be educated about your community, find out where your real needs are, and that will be helpful in being articulate to your legislators. So if you have particular need and you're aware of it, it's a good thing to be stating it. But as Allison had mentioned, you carry a lot more weight than you may think, and that it's very, very important. And one single person oftentimes can be the key to a legislative success.
Well, if I could jump in and ask a kind of a related piggyback question, I think there's so much policy that impacts city building that happens at the state level, and not every citizen automatically recognizes that. One of the things that we talked about in preparing for this session is, the fact that this is an election year, and although the presidential campaigns are generating most of the focus in energy, every seat in the Ohio House of Representatives is up for election this year. Half the seats in the Ohio Senate are. And Allison and Jonathan, I wonder if both of you could share some thoughts about the types of questions that our viewers should be thinking about asking candidates, and what sorts of, we've talked about a number of them, but what sorts of state issues should people be focused on as they're thinking about the fact that we have a lot of legislative seats in the state house up for grabs this year?
Michael, what a great question. We at Greater Ohio just last week did a soft launch of our candidates questions that, and I can provide the link later, but basically that's exactly it. It's a script that individuals can use if they'd like to ask key questions of their legislators. And we also provide some data points that sort of like, can be supportive talking points in that conversation, or at least help orient the readers. So, we are encouraging people to talk to their legislators today about brownfields. What are you going to do about the brownfields that we have? They're an untapped opportunity. What are you going to do about public transportation? the mismatch between jobs and where people live is really a growing concern. So we have some of those questions listed. We also offer solutions, right? Because nobody likes to be told you're doing something wrong, first of all. And then second, they don't like to be told you're doing it wrong, but I can't help you fix it, right? So we do offer some of those solutions. The other thing I would say is that particularly because it is an election year, and I guess I can say this because I'm not under a grant, but advocacy is really important. And as you're making your campaign donations, like have these conversations, right? And make sure that, I know it's different, there's not in-person fundraisers this year, but virtual fundraisers, like ask your questions, right? That is how things get done, is that in those conversations, particularly ones where you have a lot of access because it's a campaign fundraiser, those are the times to really push this. Now, if you don't give fundraising campaign, if you don't do fundraisers and campaign donations, you should certainly still continue to ask those questions, but taking advantage of those opportunities is, we should be doing that today to keep the drum roll beating so that when it comes to the budget time in February this year and then in the future, it's not the first time the legislator's hearing it. This is like the 50th time that they've heard it from 20 different people. So they know it's like a critical issue. That's lobbying 101.
Yeah. Well, I certainly concur with Allison's commentary. Again, we go back to the whole issue of term limits because the education isn't out there. So educating them is important. We understand that certainly Heritage Ohio's, I'll call it coffees, where we were bringing in the state to go through education. What we're trying to do is to target legislators that are there today, but also the legislators of tomorrow. So who's prominent in the community will likely rise up, making sure that the information is out there, because that candidly has been our primary challenge through time. I know it is for you, Allison, certainly is for us, making sure that the message is continuously repeated, because we do not have the kind of continuity that would be important. And so consequently, education, or advocacy, as you have said, is so important in order to make sure that that message is out there. So for anybody who is trying to advocate for their issues, it's making sure, don't assume that you've had this conversation a couple of years ago, and so consequently it's already on the table, you don't have to worry about it. You've got to repeat it over, because candidly, the changing sphere, the number of people who actually understand the issue oftentimes is lost because the continuity of the legislature is not there.
And it takes a long time, even if you have a champion, so the sponsor for the TMUD proposal, right? He gets it, he is bought in, but it is like he has to educate his colleagues, and like policy change is just a long-term game. Like you just have to accept, at least in Ohio, it's probably a 3 or 4 year process on like a good, on an issue that's non-controversial, right? So like the timelines are just, it's very frustrating as an advocate, because feel like you're constantly putting in energy, and then like feel like nothing happened. But then retrospectively, you realize like, yeah, you did incrementally move the ball down the field, but it just takes a long time. And sort of that the realization that it's a long haul, I think can also help with people sort of pace themselves and measure success in different ways.
Well, Allison does bring up a good point, and that is there are champions out there, and essentially they sustain their continuity of effort by switching between the House and the Senate.
Yes.
So there are those, and being knowledgeable about who that is very important, because that helps to have a continuity of thought, even though they're switching from House to Senate.
No, I think that's very, very, very well put. Lauren, I know we're coming up on our hour. I think we probably have time for one more question from the audience.
Okay. We can also do closing remarks as well. So if our panelists have anything they want to add at the end. Let's see. What kind of development incentives could spur more projects downtown?
And I think if to Lauren's point, if we could kind of weave in any closing remarks that you want to share with the audience as part of your answer, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, certainly the thrust that we've had as far as the use has been largely focused on housing, because housing has been the missing ingredient in many of our downtowns, large and small. And so therefore, bringing back the 24-hour life and vitality is a critical component to making better office environments, better retail environments, where places where people want to work, because people want to be where energy is at, where there's a confluence of energy. You know, one other item, sort of my closing commentary, I thought would be interesting to add into it is the American Institute of Architects did a detailed analysis of what would make cities better, and they came up with a blueprint for better cities. And I think it talks a lot about the strategy that is being used across the state, particularly with the state historic tax credit. And it really talks to the environmental issues as well. So the conclusion of that commentary, if I read just a couple quick blurbs, I think you'll find it to be interesting. But here's the conclusion of Blueprints for Better Cities that was issued at the Javits Center in New York at the American Institute of Architects Conference, and then issued to all architects. And here's the conclusion. And it's the path to a sustainable, equitable world must flow through existing buildings. New construction accounts for only 2 to 4% of the building activity each year. So to hit the Paris Accords for environmental goals, you must have, and to meet crucial affordable housing needs, and to enhance social and cultural well-being, we must look to the immense stock of buildings we already have. Existing buildings simply offer the quickest and most effective way to a better world, with limitless opportunities for architects and planners to steward, to renew, and transform. And I thought that that was a very telling conclusion to a very detailed study. So, I'll leave that as a commentary. It talks a lot about the strategy that Cleveland has taken, but when we're talking about environmental needs as well, clearly it is very effective in that regard.
I would say both the final question and then just sort of as a wrap up. So that the concerns that you may have or the solutions an individual may have, bring them to already formed entities, bodies like the Advocacy Committee at Downtown Cleveland Alliance to Greater Ohio. And it's not just because we want to play traffic cop on what does or doesn't get to legislators, but because there's power in numbers and power in relationships, right? So like we already have a lot of relationships with legislators. You guys have a lot of relationships with your council people, as well as state and federal legislators. And so sort of that united voice issue, right? Like what we find often at the State House is that when you have 5 different people asking similar asks, but they're not all coordinated, it's really easy for policymakers to say, we're not going to pick among any of these and not do anything about it, right? And that, I think, historically has been sort of the issue around public transportation funding. But when advocates can get behind a single issue and kind of do all the horse trading behind the scenes first, that is when the power really starts to happen, right? That is where you start to get the momentum. And so I guess I'm just sort of encouraging your audience members to make sure to like tap into these existing resources, because they're going to get much farther on their issue by working in partnership with other organizations and individuals who are thinking about these issues than trying to go it alone. But thank you for the invitation. This is always fun to talk shop. And it's always great to talk about Cleveland. I miss seeing you guys in person, and I hope I can get up there soon and we can all see each other sometime soon in person.
Well, thanks to both of you, Jonathan and Allison. And Allison, I think that was a terrific note to end on. We too look forward to being able to get together face to face in larger numbers sometime very, very soon. But in the meantime, we very much look forward to continuing to work with you at Greater Ohio on our areas of common interest. And Jonathan, I have the pleasure of working with day in and day out as a member of the Downtown Cleveland Alliance Board of Directors. So I want to thank, again, you both for joining us. Thank you, Lauren, for all of your work in making today's webinar possible, and the whole team at Downtown Cleveland Alliance. Again, want to thank Cleveland Magazine and Community Leader for their support of the project, and thank our audience for taking the time to join us. We will be back next week at 3 o'clock on Thursday for the next episode of Downtown Now, where we will be talking with representatives from Cleveland Votes, the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, and the Ohio Secretary of State's office to talk about voter registration, voting by mail, the U.S. Census, and all sorts of important things to the future of downtown Cleveland. I hope you'll be able to join us for next week's session. Until then, thank you and have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.